The shriek of alarms tore through the prison transport vessel as it careened toward the surface of Epsilon 9, a moon no one was supposed to know existed. Guard Captain Greg Patterson clutched the manual override controls, his knuckles white with strain. The transport ship, carrying 37 of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals, shuddered violently as it entered the moon's thin atmosphere. "Engine 2 is gone," shouted Lena, his second in command. "3's failing. We're going down hard." Greg gritted his teeth. "Send the distress beacon." "Full encryption. No one else can know we're here." The ship plummeted through clouds of ammonia gas, the hull groaning under the stress. Greg knew what would happen if word got out that a prison transport carrying members of the Vex Syndicate had crashed. Every bounty hunter and crime lord in the sector would descend on Epsilon 9 like vultures. "Brace for impact," Greg shouted, pulling back on the controls with all his strength. The ship's nose lifted slightly, but it wasn't enough. They slammed into the surface with a deafening crash, skidding across barren rock for nearly a kilometer before coming to rest at the edge of a deep ravine. When Greg regained consciousness, his head was throbbing and something warm trickled down his temple. Blood. He blinked, trying to clear his vision in the emergency lighting that bathed the bridge in an eerie red glow. "Lena," he called out, pushing himself upright. His body screamed in protest, broken ribs may be worse. No answer. Greg forced himself to stand, stumbling over to Lena's station. She was slumped over the controls, not breathing. He checked for a pulse, finding nothing. A piece of metal had pierced her throat during impact. "Damn it," he whispered, closing her eyes gently. The ship's systems were in chaos, warning lights flashing across every panel. The prison containment section indicator was flashing red. The cells had lost power. Greg grabbed his sidearm and the emergency kit from under his console. He needed to secure the prisoners before they realized the opportunity they had. The corridors were dark, emergency lighting flickering weakly. Greg limped his way toward the containment section, using the wall for support. His uniform was torn, and he could feel blood soaking through in several places. The pain was intense, but he pushed it away. Right now, all that mattered was making sure those prisoners stayed locked up until rescue arrived. If rescue arrived. When he reached the main security door to the containment section, Greg found it partially jammed. He forced it open enough to squeeze through, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. Inside, the situation was worse than he'd feared. The power failure had affected all the cell doors. Some had jammed shut, but others had slid partially open, and the cells were empty. Greg raised his weapon, scanning the shadows. The containment section was eerily quiet, too quiet. A sound caught his attention, a soft whimpering coming from the far end of the corridor. He moved cautiously toward it, weapon ready. As he approached, he could make out shapes huddled in the corner of what had been the communal area for minimum security prisoners. The aliens were pressed together, their forms barely visible in the darkness. There were at least 20 of them, various species, all trembling. None of them made a move toward him, despite the fact that he was clearly injured and alone. "Don't shoot," a voice said from the group. It belonged to a Centaurian, his blue skin almost black in the dim light. "We won't fight, we can't." Greg kept his weapon raised. "What happened to the others?" "The Vex took them," said another prisoner, a female Procyon with iridescent scales. "They broke out first, killed 3 guards and fled. They said they'd come back for anyone who tried to escape." Greg processed this information quickly. The Vex Syndicate members, the most dangerous criminals on board, were loose on the moon's surface. But these prisoners, mostly non-violent offenders being transported to minimum security facilities, were too terrified to attempt escape. Why are you still here?" Greg asked, lowering his weapon slightly. The Centaurian's 4 eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of extreme stress in his species. "We heard the noises outside. Something's out there, not just the Vex, something native to this moon. We can hear them moving around the ship." Greg listened. At first he heard nothing beyond the occasional creak of the damaged vessel. Then he caught a scratching sound, like claws on metal, moving along the outer hull. "The Vex took all the weapons," the Procyon female said, her voice quavering. "They said they'd feed us to whatever's out there if we tried to follow." Greg looked at the huddled mass of aliens. They were convicts, yes, but most were in for smuggling, fraud, or other non-violent crimes. And right now, they were terrified. Even in the dim light, he could see their limbs shaking, tentacles quivering, breathing apparatus working overtime. A loud bang echoed from somewhere in the ship, followed by an inhuman screech that made Greg's blood run cold. The prisoners pressed closer together, some making small sounds of distress. Greg made a decision. "Listen to me. I'm Guard Captain Patterson. If we want to survive, we need to work together. I'll protect you, but you have to help me secure this section of the ship." "Why should we trust you?" asked a draconian prisoner, his scaled face contorted with fear and suspicion. "Because right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and whatever's out there," Greg replied. "And because I'm offering you a deal. Help me survive until rescue arrives, and I'll testify that you cooperated." Could mean reduced sentences for all of you. The prisoners exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "What do you need us to do?" the Centaurian finally asked. "First, we need to barricade this section. Then we need to get emergency power restored to the communications array so I can boost our distress signal." Greg winced as he shifted his weight, the pain in his side intensifying. "I can't do it alone." The Procyon female moved forward cautiously. "I was an engineer before my conviction. I can help with the power systems." "Good," Greg nodded. "What's your name?" "Kethai," she replied. "I'm Nyx," the Centaurian added. "I can help too. I worked maintenance on ships like this." Over the next hour, Greg organized the prisoners into groups. Some worked on barricading the entrances to their section, while others helped Kethai access the emergency power controls. Greg himself tried to treat his injuries as best he could with the limited medical supplies in his emergency kit. The work kept the prisoners distracted, but every time the strange noises outside intensified, they would freeze, their alien physiology betraying their fear in various ways: bristling fur, flaring gill membranes, clicking mandibles, dilating pupils. As night fell on Epsilon 9, the temperature dropped dramatically. The ship's environmental controls were failing, and the cold was seeping in through the damaged hull. The prisoners huddled together for warmth in what had once been the guards' break room, now their makeshift refuge. Greg sat apart from them, checking his communicator for any response to their distress signal. Nothing. The moon's unusual magnetic field was likely interfering with transmission. They needed to boost the signal strength, but that would require accessing the main communications array on the upper deck where the noises were most frequent. "We're going to freeze if the temperature keeps dropping," Nick said, his 4 arms wrapped around himself. "The emergency power isn't enough to run the heating systems," Kethai added, "and we can't risk a fire inside the ship." Greg looked at the frightened faces around him. Even the toughest looking among them, a burly Orion with ritual scars covering his face, was shivering uncontrollably. But it wasn't just the cold making them shake. It was the fear, the darkness, the unknown creatures outside, the Vex Syndicate members who might return at any moment. An idea struck Greg. When he was a kid, His grandfather used to whistle old Earth tunes when they went hiking in the mountains at night. "To keep the bears away," he'd said with a wink. Greg had always found the familiar melodies comforting in the darkness. Without really thinking about it, Greg began to whistle softly an old song his grandfather had taught him, "You Are My Sunshine." The sound was jarring at first in the tense silence, and several prisoners looked at him with confusion or alarm. But he continued, the simple melody filling the cold air. After a minute or two, he noticed something strange. The constant trembling of the prisoners had lessened slightly. A few were watching him with curious expressions, their attention diverted from their fear. When he finished the tune, there was a moment of silence. "What was that?" asked a small, furred alien with large ears. "An old Earth song," Greg replied. "My grandfather used to whistle it. It was pleasant," the alien said, ears twitching. "Different from our music, but soothing." Greg smiled slightly. "I know more if you want to hear them." The alien nodded, and several others did too. Greg began another tune, "Home on the Range." As he whistled, he noticed the shaking diminish further. The simple act of focusing on the music was giving the prisoners something else to think about besides their fear. When a particularly loud screech came from outside, several prisoners jumped, but Greg just whistled louder, drawing their attention back to him. It was working. The music was helping them stay calm throughout that long, cold night. Greg whistled every song he could remember. Old folk tunes, pop songs from his youth, even advertising jingles. The prisoners listened, some even attempting to hum along or replicate the sounds with their various vocal apparatuses. A few shared songs from their own worlds, strange and beautiful melodies that echoed in the darkness. By morning, the constant shaking had stopped. The fear wasn't gone. It couldn't be, given their situation, but it had become manageable. The shared experience of the music had created a tentative bond between the human guard and the alien prisoners. "We need to access the main communications array," Greg told them as they shared the meager rations from the emergency supplies. "If we can boost the signal strength, we might be able to cut through the interference and reach Alliance space." "The upper deck isn't safe," Kethai said, her scales shimmering with anxiety. "That's where the noises are coming from." "I know," Greg nodded, "but we don't have a choice. The emergency beacon alone isn't strong enough, and our food and water won't last more than a few days." "I'll go with you," Nix volunteered, surprising everyone including himself. 4 arms are better than 2 for repairs. Greg looked at the Centaurian thoughtfully. "Why would you risk your life to help me? I'm the one who was taking you to prison." Nix's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a Centaurian equivalent of a shrug. "You could have left us, or used us as bait. You didn't." Several other prisoners volunteered as well, including Kethai and the burly Orion, who introduced himself as Czar. "We'll go in a small group," Greg decided. "Nix, Kethai, Czar, and me. The rest of you stay here and maintain the barricades. If we're not back in 3 hours, assume the worst." As they prepared to leave, Greg checked his sidearm. Only 6 charges left, not nearly enough if they encountered multiple threats. Czar had fashioned crude weapons from broken pieces of the ship, metal bars and sharpened fragments which he distributed to the team. "Stay close, stay quiet," Greg instructed as they prepared to leave their secure area. "And if I start whistling, it means we need to calm down and focus. Understood?" The aliens nodded, gripping their makeshift weapons tightly. They moved through the ship cautiously, passing through corridors that showed signs of violence, blood smears on walls, bullet holes, claw marks in metal. The upper deck was colder, the hull breached somewhere nearby, allowing the moon's frigid atmosphere to seep in. The communications array was located in a room near the front of the ship. As they approached, the scratching sounds intensified. Something was moving on the other side of the door. Greg held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. He listened carefully, trying to determine how many creatures might be inside. At least 2, maybe more. He began to whistle softly, a slow, calming melody that helped steady his own nerves as much as those of his companions. Zar looked at him questioningly. Greg stopped whistling long enough to whisper, "We go in fast. Kethai, head straight for the console. Nyx, cover her. Zar and I will handle whatever's in there." They nodded, tension visible in their alien features but without the paralyzing fear from before. Greg counted down with his fingers 3, 2, 1, then slammed the door control. The door slid open to reveal 3 creatures unlike anything Greg had ever seen. They resembled giant insects, with multiple segmented limbs and elongated heads featuring compound eyes and clicking mandibles. They turned toward the intruders, their mandibles opening to reveal rows of sharp teeth. "Now!" Greg shouted, firing his weapon at the nearest creature. The energy bolt struck it in the center mass, sending it reeling backward. Zar charged forward with surprising speed, swinging his metal bar at another creature with enough force to crack its exoskeleton. Kethai darted toward the communications console while Nyx covered her, using all 4 arms to fend off the third creature with his makeshift spear. Greg fired again, dropping his target permanently, then moved to help Nyx. The battle was brief but intense. When it was over, all 3 creatures lay dead, and the team had suffered only minor injuries, cuts and bruises, nothing serious. "What are they?" Kethai asked, her voice shaking slightly as she worked on the console. "Native species, I guess," Greg replied, examining one of the corpses. "Probably drawn to the ship after the crash. Maybe they were just curious, or maybe they're predators." "They're predators," Zar confirmed grimly, pointing to the creature's mouth parts. "Those are for tearing flesh." Greg nodded. "How's the communications array looking, Kethai?" She manipulated the controls with her dexterous fingers. "Damaged but functional. I can reroute power from non-essential systems to boost the signal. It will take time, though." "Do it," Greg said. "Nyx, help her. Zar and I will stand guard." As Kethai and Nyx worked on the communications array, Greg kept watch at the door. The adrenaline of the fight was wearing off, and the pain from his injuries was returning with a vengeance. He winced as he probed his side gently. The ribs were definitely broken, and he suspected internal bleeding. "You're injured worse than you've let on," Zar observed quietly. Greg shrugged. "Nothing I can do about it now." The Orion regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Why did you become a prison guard?" The question caught Greg off guard. "Family tradition, I guess. My father was a guard and his father before him." "Do you enjoy locking people up?" Greg frowned. "It's not about enjoyment. It's about keeping society safe. Even when the laws are unjust," Zar pressed. Greg was saved from answering by a triumphant exclamation from Kethai. "I've got it. Signal boosted to maximum capacity. Broadcasting on all Alliance emergency frequencies." "How long until someone might hear it?" Greg asked. Kethai's expression fell slightly. "Hard to say. Hours, maybe days. The magnetic interference is still strong." Greg nodded, trying not to show his disappointment. "Then we head back to the secure area and wait. At least now we have a chance." As they prepared to leave, Nyx suddenly froze, his 4 eyes widening. "Listen," he whispered. They all fell silent. At first Greg heard nothing, then he caught at footsteps, human-like footsteps, approaching from the corridor that led to the ship's exit ramp. "The Vex," Greg whispered. "They're back." Without needing to be told, the team quickly hid behind equipment and in shadows. Greg positioned himself near the door, his weapon ready. Moments later, 5 figures appeared in the doorway, 4 aliens of different species and 1 human. All wore the distinctive neural implant scars that marked members of the Vex Syndicate. "The signal's coming from in here," the human said, a tall man with a cybernetic eye implant. "Someone's been busy." "Survivors from the crash?" asked one of his companions, a draconian with jet-black scales. "Doesn't matter. Can't leave witnesses." The human stepped further into the room, scanning the shadows. "Anyone here might as well come out now. Make it easier on yourselves." Greg remained motionless, signaling the others to do the same. The Vex members spread out, searching the room. One passed close to Kethai's hiding spot, and Greg saw her scales ripple with fear. She was about to lose control. Greg began to whistle, the same soothing melody from the night before. The Vex members whirled toward the sound, weapons raising, but Greg had already rolled to a new position. "What the hell?" the human leader snarled. "Playing games, are we?" Greg continued whistling, moving again as they fired at his previous position. The melody was as much for his team as to confuse the Vex. It was a signal, a reminder to stay calm and wait for the right moment. The distraction worked. As the Vex focused on locating the source of the whistling, Zar burst from hiding and tackled one of them to the ground. Nyx and Kethai emerged simultaneously, each taking on an opponent. Greg fired his weapon at the human leader, who dodged with enhanced reflexes that could only come from illegal neural augmentations. The leader returned fire, forcing Greg into cover. The room erupted into chaos. Despite being outnumbered, the Vex members were dangerous fighters, augmented with various cybernetic enhancements that gave them advantages in strength, speed, and reflexes. Greg's whistling turned into a battle tune, faster and more intense. His team responded to the rhythm, coordinating their attacks to the beat. It was surreal, this improvised combat symphony, but it worked. The music kept them focused, united against a common enemy. The tide turned when Zar managed to disarm the draconian Vex member and use the weapon against another. Greg finally got a clear shot at the human leader, hitting him in the leg. As the leader fell, the remaining Vex member, a lithe, serpentine alien, made a break for the door. "Stop him!" Greg shouted. "He'll warn the others." Nyx tried to intercept but wasn't fast enough. The Vex member disappeared into the corridor. Greg's whistle faltered as he realized what this meant: more Vex would be coming, and they wouldn't be surprised next time. "We need to get back to the others now," Greg ordered, helping Kethai to her feet. She'd taken a blow to the head but seemed otherwise unharmed. "What about them?" Zar asked, gesturing to the injured Vex members. Greg hesitated only briefly. "Bring them. They're still prisoners in my custody." They secured the Vex members as best they could with improvised restraints and began the tense journey back to their secure area. Greg's whistling guided them through the darkened corridors, a thread of sound leading them home. The other prisoners were shocked when they returned with captives. Questions flew fast, but Greg cut them off. "The Vex know we're here and that we've sent a distress signal. They'll be coming in force and soon. We need to prepare." Under Greg's direction, they reinforced their barricades and prepared for a siege. The wounded Vex members were secured in a storage room under guard. Greg taught more of the prisoners his whistling technique, explaining how it helped maintain calm and focus during crisis. "It's just music," said a skeptical Procyon prisoner. "It's more than that," Nyx replied. "When we were fighting, the whistle kept us together, kept us from panicking. It works." As the hours passed, tension built. Every sound from outside their secured area caused the prisoners to start shaking again. Greg would begin whistling whenever he noticed, and gradually, others would join in. The simple act created a sense of unity, of shared purpose, that transcended their status as prisoners and guard. Night fell again on Epsilon 9. The temperature dropped once more, but this time they were better prepared, having scavenged insulating materials from throughout their section of the ship. Huddled together for warmth, the diverse group of aliens and the lone human guard waited for either rescue or attack. It was just past midnight, according to Greg's chronometer, when the first explosion hit. The Vex had returned, and they were trying to blast their way through the barricades. "Positions," Greg called out, and the prisoners moved with surprising discipline to their assigned defensive posts. They had limited weapons. Greg's sidearm with its few remaining charges, the weapons taken from the captured Vex members, and an assortment of makeshift clubs, spears, and shields. Greg began to whistle as the second explosion rocked their position. This time, several prisoners joined in, creating an eerie, multi-tonal melody that echoed through their defended space. It steadied their nerves, focused their minds on the coming fight rather than their fear. The third explosion breached the outer barricade. Smoke filled the corridor as shadowy figures moved forward. Greg raised his weapon, took aim, and fired. The battle had begun. What followed was a desperate struggle for survival. The Vex attackers, numbering at least 15, had superior weapons and training. But Greg's unlikely allies fought with the determination of those who had nothing to lose, and their strange, whistled battle song never ceased. The fight moved back and forth through the corridors and rooms of their defended area. Greg was everywhere, directing the defense, firing precise shots when needed, and always whistling to maintain the morale of his troops. He took a glancing hit to his shoulder early in the fight, but ignored the burning pain and fought on. Zar proved himself a natural leader, organizing a flanking maneuver that caught several Vex members by surprise. Kethai used her engineering knowledge to rig traps that disabled two more. Nyx's 4 arms made him a formidable fighter in close quarters, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Gradually, they were forced to fall back to their innermost defensive position, the former guard's break room. Several prisoners had fallen, though none fatally. Greg's wounds were slowing him down, the loss of blood making him light-headed. As they made their final stand, backs literally to the wall, Greg's whistle finally faltered. He was exhausted, injured, and running out of hope. The Vex regrouped outside the room, preparing for one final push that would surely overwhelm the defenders. Then, faintly at first but growing stronger, Nyx began to whistle the melody Greg had taught them. One by one, the other aliens joined in, each adding their own unique vocal quality to the strange chorus. Greg looked around at them in amazement, then added his own whistle back to the mix. The Vex attacked, bursting through the door with weapons blazing. The defenders met them head-on, their unlikely song rising above the sounds of combat. It was chaos, a blur of motion and noise, but somehow the whistled melody held them together, coordinating their movements almost instinctively. Greg found himself facing the human Vex leader who had recovered enough to join the attack. The man smiled coldly, raising a high-powered blaster. "Nothing personal, guard, just business." Before he could fire, a deafening roar filled the ship, drowning out even the whistling. The deck plating vibrated beneath their feet. Everyone, Vex and defenders alike, froze in confusion. "What the hell is that?" the Vex leader demanded. Greg felt a surge of hope. "That," he said with a grim smile, "is the sound of an Alliance heavy cruiser's engines. Sounds like our distress call got through after all." The Vex leader's face contorted with rage. He raised his weapon again, determined to at least take Greg with him, but never got the chance to fire. A precision shot from the doorway took him down. Alliance Marines in full combat gear poured into the room, quickly subduing the remaining Vex members. "Guard Captain Patterson," called out the Marine lieutenant leading the team. "We picked up your distress signal. Looks like we got here just in time." Greg nodded weakly, suddenly aware of how much blood he'd lost. "The prisoners," he managed to say before his knees buckled. "They helped. They fought alongside me. Remember that." As the Marines rushed to stabilize him, Greg heard the whistling start again, soft at first, then growing stronger. The alien prisoners, even as they were being secured by the Marines, were whistling the songs he had taught them. Not in fear this time, but in solidarity, in acknowledgement of what they had endured together. 3 weeks later, Greg sat in a recovery room on Alliance Station Gamma, still healing from his injuries. The door slid open to admit Admiral Chen, the sector commander. "Captain Patterson," the Admiral greeted him. "How are you feeling?" "Better, sir," Greg replied, sitting up straighter despite the pain in his ribs. "Still have some healing to do." "I've reviewed your report about the Epsilon 9 incident," Chen said, taking a seat. "Remarkable story. Even more remarkable are the testimonies from the prisoners." Greg said nothing, waiting. "Every single one of them praised your leadership and courage," Chen continued. "They specifically requested clemency in exchange for their cooperation during the crisis. Quite unprecedented." "They earned it, sir," Greg said firmly. "Without them, I wouldn't have survived." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "The Alliance judiciary agrees. All non-Vex prisoners involved have had their sentences reduced, and several have been offered rehabilitation programs instead of incarceration." Greg felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. You're the one who turned a ship full of enemy aliens into allies." Chen looked at him curiously. "Your report mentioned something about whistling. The prisoners mentioned it too, but I'm not sure I understand the significance." Greg smiled. "It sounds strange, I know. But in the darkness, when they were shaking with fear, it gave them something to focus on besides their terror. It became something we shared, something that unified us despite our differences." "A universal language," Chen mused. "Music." "Yes, sir, exactly that." After the Admiral left, Greg stood carefully and moved to the window. The stars beyond the station gleamed bright and constant. Somewhere out there, his unlikely allies were beginning new chapters in their lives, carrying with them the melodies that had helped them survive. Greg began to whistle softly, the familiar tune bringing back memories of those tense days on Epsilon 9. He thought of Nyx, Kethai, Zar, and all the others who had fought beside him. Alien prisoners who had cowered in the dark until a human guard whistled songs that helped them find their courage. Different species, different worlds, different lives, but for a brief time, united by simple melodies and a shared will to survive. Greg finished his song and smiled. Some bonds, it seemed, transcended the barriers of species and circumstance. Some songs needed no translation. 1 month later, Greg received a package at his apartment on Earth, where he was completing his recovery. Inside was a crude but functional musical instrument, clearly handmade, with a note written in several different scripts. The Alliance translator rendered it into English, "For the human who taught us to whistle in the dark. May you never need to use this, but if you do, remember you are not alone. We still whistle your songs among the stars." It was signed by all 32 surviving prisoners. Greg picked up the instrument and, after studying it for a moment, figured out how to play it. The notes were strange to his ears at first, alien in their arrangement but beautiful in their own way. He began to whistle along with the instrument, creating a harmony between human and alien music. Outside his window, the sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of Kethai's scales and Nyx's eyes. Greg continued playing as darkness fell, his music a bridge across the vast gulfs that separated worlds and species. The universe was still full of dangers, still had its dark corners where fear could take hold. But Greg had learned something important on that damaged prison ship, that sometimes the simplest things could bring light to the darkness. A whistle, a song, a moment of connection. He played until the stars came out, wondering if somewhere among them, alien voices were whistling the same tune.